Martin Luther, are you the author of these writings?
I am. You question the authority of the Church Council, sir?
My conscience is captive to the word of God.
I'm interested in the truth. Christianity is tearing apart.
And just when we need unity most, you create confusion.
My God, who is this Martin Luther?
The struggling little German monk is intoxicated with himself. Sober him.
You threatened with excommunication.
I'm a loyal son of the Church, and if you do what you can, you will be delivered to the Inquisition. They'll burn him for sure.
If Luther were to lift one finger, every peasant in Germany would rise up behind him.
Do you recant what you've written?
I cannot, and I will not recant.
No! Luther's getting married to a runaway nun.
He wouldn't dare.
By order of His Holiness, the works of Martin Luther shall be erased from the memory of man!
The Holy War has just begun.
Let somebody else be roasted like a pig! Cowards! You call yourselves Christians!
Damn that heretic.
This will separate us from Rome forever.
I answer to God's rule, not Roman.
You are tearing the word apart.
Did you really think there wouldn't be a cost?
Okay. You can bring the mics back up, thanks. All right, anybody know who that was? Luther. These are really helpful words, thanks. And how many of you have seen this movie? Any of you? Oh, this is probably a good one for us to watch. We have it. Maybe we can set up a time in a few weeks and do like a Friday night showing or whatnot. Anybody ever heard of Martin Luther? Okay. Now, I have to ask because, I was in college and I remember one of the history professors saying he found out about this traffic in papers, people writing papers for other people, when someone turned in a paper on Martin Luther King for a class on Martin Luther. And they didn't know there was a difference. Yeah. I remember actually when Jacob was younger saying to him, now, you realize who Martin Luther King Jr. was named after? And he goes, Dad? Like, okay, yeah, you're right. Martin Luther King Sr., right, but he's named after Martin Luther. Do we know anything about Martin Luther? Yeah? That's actually Martin Luther King. That's okay. That's still pretty good. Yeah, this is a long time. It's about 500 years ago. Martin Luther was actually a priest. And he became a priest because, if you notice, there was a scene where he's in this, you see the storm and the lightning coming down? He was caught out in the storm, and he was scared to death. And he thought he was going to die, and so he was going to go into law. His dad wanted to go into law. His dad was a merchant, very wealthy, but wanted him to be very prestigious. And so he was looking to go into law, but he was caught in the storm and thought he was going to die. And so he prayed, Saint Anne, he says, if you save me, I'll become a monk. And guess what? He made it. So he became a monk. But all his life, he was tormented by this idea of God being a God of wrath, that God was about judgment. And there was a heavy emphasis on like purgatory, where you spend literally millions of years in suffering, to pay for your sins, and you could pay money to try and get out or get people out. And people who were very poor were giving their last penny trying to help those that they loved. And he was just scared to death of this God. But when he began to study, he was allowed to actually to read the Bible, which the common folk couldn't do because it was in Latin, and most people were illiterate anyways. And it wasn't translated into the language of the people. But he was trained to do it, and he began to read. And he began to see that what he read in the Bible about God was very different than what he'd been told about God. That he heard about a God who wasn't about wrath, but about love and about forgiveness. And he began to question things and raise up questions about what was going on. And his thought was that people who were really leaders in the church didn't see some of these things that were going on, and found out that they weren't actually really happy with him for bringing it up. It was a very difficult time. There's a certain irony that actually the Catholic Church that ended up excommunicating him, Roman Catholic Church, within the next 100 years reformed most of the things that Luther was raising questions about. But by that time, there was this huge split, and more churches began to come out of that. And what's very interesting about it is that his big thing was helping helping us to see that we are loved, that we just belong to God, and it isn't about what we do, but what God does for us. In fact, I think many of us have experienced some of that same thing. I mean, how many of us have been part of churches where we felt like, if we weren't doing things a certain way or looking a certain way or not, that we just weren't up to snuff. And that was his big struggle. I mean, he would go to confession to confess his sins, hoping to be forgiven. And then he'd feel good about confessing, and then he'd feel guilty about feeling good, and he'd get back in line. And his confessor finally said to him, do something worth confessing before you come back, okay? Right? And so for him, it was this internal struggle and finding a place of freedom. Now, what was interesting after this whole Reformation is that the followers of Martin Luther, they actually began to be wrapped up in the whole idea of it's this head thing. It's about what we actually believe and what's written down. We started writing all these books, the Book of Concord and other documents, and so soon it became this thing that did you really leave the right thing? It also became a thing about were you living in the right country, right? If you live in Norway today, what religion would you be? You're a Lutheran, automatically. It's a state church. You pay for the church in your taxes. Did you know that? No. Yeah. Right, so you would go by what country you were in. It became this cultural thing. And so, actually, we can click on. We're talking about baptized we live, and we'll get to that. But how then should we live? But go to the next one here. We have all these different background churches, right? We have American Baptist churches. We have African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Okay, we have Catholics. Now, this is interesting. I couldn't find a logo for the Catholic Church, but this is for the movement Catholics Come Home. Heard about this? They're really trying to connect with people who've left the Catholic Church, in the past maybe few decades. I found it kind of ironic. I was thinking about this after watching Luther. It's like, some of us left about 500 years ago. So I don't know. Or you go 1,000 years back with the Catholic Orthodox churches split. Am I too far forward here? Can you move the speakers forward? Maybe turn me down just a little bit. Jacob, you know how to turn mine down? Oh, Wayne's there. I'm sorry, Wayne, I couldn't see you behind the pillar. All right. Over 1,000 years ago, we already had a split. We have, keep overcoming, keep going. Presbyterian Church. We have Methodist. And this is kind of from what we're looking at. Methodist Church, there we go, next one. And back as we live, talking about Lutheranism as a way of life, that we often think of these as separate churches. And really what we are is different movements within the church Catholic, they would say. Anybody know what the word Catholic means? Huh? Well, it can be Christian. All Christians, from the fall, the word actually means universal. It means the whole church, So often we say Catholic, meaning the Roman Catholic Church. The word Catholic actually means the church as a whole. And so we're all a part of this. And all these are different movements. Now, these past few weeks, or past few months actually, we've been talking about reclaiming Jesus' message for everyone. And in many ways, we've been talking about going back to what we heard in the Bible. And we did some stuff with McLaren's book, A New Kind of Christianity. But one of the things that I think is very important is also look at where we've come from is our community. And originally we started coming out of Lutheran movement. Right? And it was kind of interesting to me. I think originally we were talking about this one time that I said, I want to be a part of a church where I felt like I was welcome. And a lot of us have had bad experiences in churches. But we also want to be a part of a church that that it wasn't like a cult. I want to know that there's some tradition, that it has some connection back to this church that's come before. And I think it's important for us to lift that up. And so while we may be a separate movement, there are a lot of things that will be similar in different movements. In fact, a lot of these churches, like Presbyterian, Episcopalian, we have a lot of connections with. Even the Catholic Church, about I want to say 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, we actually came to an agreement saying, you know what, that whole Reformation stuff and the things we disagreed about, we were really saying the same things, only we didn't realize it. So it took us 500 years to get there. All right? But I think it's important to kind of talk about how we got here. In many ways, I think the things we've been talking about these past few months come from this movement of reform that you see in Luther, and actually came before that you see in the early church as well. And I want to explore this a little bit more. We can go to the next thing. Now, first off, we have to understand, like I say, the early Lutherans, they kind of got wrapped up in this whole intellectual thing, right? They were connected with what you believe. And used to be, you would have to question people to find out they were the right kind of Lutheran. Actually, we still kind of do that in some places, but we try not to, right? That's right. People say, now, are you Evangelical Lutheran Church in America or Missouri Synod? Say, oh, we're Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Okay. Oh, yeah, but we don't want to go there. They say, okay, you're Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Were you from the old American Lutheran Church or the Lutheran Church in America? And I say, well, American Lutheran Church. Oh, okay, good. Now, are you Danish or Norwegian Lutheran? I say, oh, we're Danish Lutheran. Right? You were Capella at least, right, Wayne? Danish Lutheran. You know, Calvary was Norwegian Lutheran background. There are German Lutherans too. They're from all over the place, right? And then they'd say, well, oh, you're Danish. That's wonderful. Now, are you a happy Dane or a sad Dane? Have you even heard of these terms? Happy Danes? The happy Danes were the Danes that said it was okay to drink. Right? They were happy Danes. The sad Danes said, no, you couldn't. All right? You ever watch the movie Babette's Feast, which was shown a clip before? It's a very interesting movie about this sad Dane community, you know, and they gave up even more than drink. So they didn't last long because they didn't have kids because they gave up everything. Right? So, but eventually, after, you know, the Europeans found this new land that was here for a long time with other people, but they found it, they started coming over, and we had waves of immigrants. And so the Lutheran Church really came over through waves of immigrants from these countries. And I can remember hearing about my grandma, Severina Amundsen, came over from Norway and married a Halvorsen. So they were 100% Norwegian. My grandma spoke Norwegian. Right? And that was very important to them, that culture. And so when churches formed, they formed off of those cultures. So it was a Norwegian Lutheran church, or a German Lutheran, or a Danish Lutheran. So you said, if you go to what was one of the churches that formed as Capella, they were Danish Lutheran. And they even had that big boat, didn't they? Right? I mean, that's someplace. They actually built the ship, so you can see the ship they came over on. In fact, the ship has become a metaphor for the church. That if you flip the ship over, when a church building is built, it looks like that. You ever found one? It's an upside down ship. So, but there's a story about these Norwegian Lutherans that came over and they asked some Presbyterians or something if they could use their church building for worship. And guess what they told them? No, you're not the right kind. So they built it, and then some Swedish Swedish Lutherans came over and they asked the Norwegian Lutherans if they could use their building. You know what they said? No. So we were on this coast. We didn't want to get together. Right? So eventually, though, what happens if you've been an immigrant here for a while and you have kids? What language do they usually speak? They speak English, right? We have this huge wave of Latinos coming. The parents speak Spanish, the kids are speaking English. And so within a generation, you'll see this changeover. And so that's what happened. So, click over. We built these church buildings, and they started out speaking like Norwegian or Danish or Swedish, and eventually they began to speak English, and they started connecting with each other. But the immigrants stopped coming, so we had to keep the churches going. So you know what we did? Next one. Lots of babies. Right? And lots of them. Remember the 50s? There was no baby boom generation. But then that stopped, and also as we began to kind of embrace this whole Protestant alliance, people no longer felt like they needed to be tied to the church they grew up in. It wasn't just the language, wasn't the language that they didn't have to be there because it was their language. They could go anywhere to speak the language. And so the church kind of began to decline. And we see abandoned church buildings and things like this. And it's not just Lutherans, it's all across these lines. But in his book, Baptized We Live, Daniel Erlander, talking about Lutheranism as a movement rather than as a denomination, but a way of thinking about God and a being, says, we kind of face this choice. And one of the choices we made is to go this way to deal with our problem. We've embraced things like, click on if we could, the church growth movement. How do you grow your church? How do you get people to come? And you do the things that make people smile and come in. And we've talked about this summer as kind of the consumer church, right? How many of you have heard churches where everything you ever want for your needs they have? Right? Right? But the problem is, what does that become about? Well, it's just about me and what I need. So we do that and you get lots of people, but is it really doing the things that God is inviting us to? And you might get a really big church. Next one, if we could. All these people, and they're all happy and raise a hand. Is that the way that Jesus invites us to? And so Erlander, we can click on it, he says, he wants to invite us to think of this rather as being a way of life, and to look at where we've come from and embrace some of that history, but in our time, and say, what does it really look like? I actually found this, I think this is from Amazon, it was a little blurry, but I like this. Look inside. Let's look inside and see what it's really about. So what we're going to be exploring these next few weeks is how do we live that? What does it mean to live as baptized people? And go ahead and click on.